Welcome to the Dozy Historian. As twilight settles over the northern fjords and the sea breathes its cool hush across the stones, we begin again, not in the fury of battle nor the roar of oars upon waves, but in the gentler corridors of time. Beneath the drifting clouds and beside the hearth fires of ancient homesteads, we look not to the famed warriors of old, but to the steady hands, thoughtful hearts, and enduring spirits of Viking women. Their names may be fewer in the sagas, their deeds less heralded in the tales of conquest, but their presence is no less central to the great story of the North. Tonight, we begin a long and quiet journey into their world. The Viking Age, as defined by historians, stretches from the final decades of the 8th century through to the mid-11th period marked by seafaring, settlement, cultural exchange, and transformation. It is an age shaped by the expansion of Norse influence outward across the icy Atlantic to Greenland and Vinland, southward to the Abbasid Caliphate, eastward to the rivers of Rus. And yet, for every expedition that set sail, there remained a world behind a world of farms, feasts, laws, rituals, and relationships, sustained by those who did not go. It is in this world that we find the rhythms of Viking women's lives steadfast, cyclical, complex. They are found not in the clamour of raids, but in the subtle layering of soil upon soil in the longhouse floor, in the combed wool stretched across looms, in the flicker of oil lamps during dark winters, in the placing of a child's carved toy beside her mother's brooch in the earth. To explore their lives is to listen carefully to the soft footfalls of those who shaped a civilization not only through strength, but through continuity, wisdom, and labour. Our sources for Viking women's lives are scattered and varied, found in the brittle pages of sagas written centuries after the age had ended, in the rusted forms of brooches and keys uncovered by the archaeologist's trowel, in the surviving laws and customs of a society at once patriarchal and oddly permissive. They are not always easy to interpret. They do not speak in one voice. But together, they offer us glimpses of constellation, rather than a single star of what it meant to be a woman in the Norse world. It is tempting, when speaking of Viking women, to imagine archetypes: the shieldmaiden, fierce and defiant; the seeress, robed in mystery and foreknowledge; the housewife, calm and enduring. But real lives resist such simplifications. A woman might be all of these, in Turner, none. She might never leave her fjord, yet shape the destiny of generations. She might be both wife and widow, mother and merchant, lover and litigant. The Viking Age was, after all, an age of transformation, not only for the lands the Norse touched, but within their own households, gods, and identities. The archaeological evidence alone is rich in suggestion. Grave goods tell stories where writing does not. A woman buried with her spindle and shears speaks to the dignity of daily labour. Another, interred with silver scales and foreign coins, hints at a life engaged in trade. There are graves with ritual staffs, others with horses, with weapons, with imported silks. These burials defy the neat categories of gendered roles. They whisper of lives lived along many axes: social, economic, spiritual, familial, and they ask us, gently, to set aside modern assumptions and let the past speak on its own terms. As we walk slowly into this narrative, it is important to move with care, not only because the evidence is fragile, but because the pace of this story demands it. This is not a tale told in declarations, but in pattern, the reappearance of brooch types across generations, in the recurrence of certain phrases in sagas, in the steady beat of seasonal labour. The Viking woman's world was one of cycles and ceremonies, of continuity and quiet power. So let us begin here, at the still point between past and present. Let us imagine the longhouse in winter, smoke curling slowly toward the rafters, the soft creak of woven cloth being shaped into form, the steady voice of an elder recounting a tale by firelight. Let us sit among the women of the North not as guests, but as listeners, not to ask questions, but to hear what endures. Tonight, and for many nights to come, we walk beside the women who shape the Norse world, not with swords, but with presence, with skill, with thought. and with a resilience written not in ink, but in bone, in soil, in silence. In the hush of the northern twilight, when the sun lingers low over snow-brushed fields and the sea laps gently at the rocky shores, life within the Viking homestead unfolds in slow, practiced motions. It begins before dawn, often in the creaking cold, when women would stir embers back into flame and set to the day's work an endless rhythm of tending, making, managing, and mending. To modern eyes, these routines might seem humble, perhaps even invisible, but to the Norse mind, they were sacred. They were civilization itself, sustained daily in the hands of women. The Viking longhouse was not merely a residence, it was the axis of life, the center of production, tradition, and social memory. Constructed of timber and turf, often dim and low-ceilinged, it was warmed by a central hearth and structured around quiet, persistent labor. Women ruled this space not as tyrants, but as stewards. Their knowledge was generational, their tasks seasonal, their decisions essential. They oversaw food storage and preparation, the weaving of garments and sails, the management of livestock and preservation of meat, and the rearing of children in both affection and ritual. Their command of the domestic domain was not considered subservient, it was understood as a foundation of social order. Agriculture played a central role in Norse survival, and women participated fully in the management of land and food. While men often ploughed and hunted, it was women who processed the yield-grinding barley into meal, fermenting dairy into cheese and skyr, drying fish, rendering fat, and preparing herbs for both cuisine and medicine. These were not idle acts but strategic ones. They ensured survival through long winters, managed resources across years of feast and famine, and preserved the knowledge of what the land could give and what it could take away. Clothing, too, was more than craft, it was expression, currency, protection, and preparation. Women were weavers in both the literal and symbolic sense. They transformed raw wool into fine garments, dyed with plants and minerals, patterned with cultural motifs. Loom weights and spindle whorls are among the most common finds in Viking-era domestic sites, each one a trace of patient, purposeful hands. The sails that carried longships across seas were woven by women, huge, painstaking creations of wool, sometimes taking a year or more to complete. Without these sails, there would have been no voyages, no raids, no sagas of glory, and yet, few stories name the women who made them. We must also imagine the emotional labor embedded in these days, the bearing and nursing of children, the tending to the ill, the mourning of the dead, and the maintenance of peace between households. Social harmony, in a world with no standing armies or police, was fragile. Women were often mediators managing not only the domestic space, but the human relationships that passed through it. Hospitality was a deeply held virtue, and its enactment fell largely on women, preparing the home for guests, managing feasts, presenting order and honor before strangers. A woman's household was her face to the world. The saga literature, though often focused on the deeds of men, contains glimpses of this reality. In Njal's saga, Bergthora is portrayed as fierce and deliberate, managing her home and responding to insult with decisive action. In Laxdala saga, women influence marriages, settle land disputes, and orchestrate vengeance with as much gravity and consequence as their male kin. Their authority is social rather than martial, but it is no less real. These women are heard, obeyed, and respected, not merely for their birth, but for their competence and clarity. Archaeology confirms what these stories suggest. Graves of women often contain household tools not as signs of subservience, but of domain and dignity. Keys are a common find, symbolic of control over food stores, chests, and dwellings. In some elite burials, women are laid to rest with elaborate brooches and imported goods, suggesting they were not just makers but managers of wealth. The placement of objects in these graves often follows careful patterns, as if to preserve not only identity, but routinia, final act of reverence for the life that once organized so many others. And so, in the quiet press of soil and stone, we find the outlines of lives deeply lived, full of effort, emotion, and enduring structure. Viking women did not build kingdoms in their own names. They built families, sustained traditions, directed labor, and upheld the laws of hospitality and kinship. They were the reason a house became a home, a farm became a legacy, a story became a lineage. Their hands may not have wielded swords, but they wove the sails. They may not have stood in the thing to speak, but they preserved the wisdom that shaped the thing's choices. In the folds of fabric, in the stews prepared, in the crops rotated, and the hearths cleaned, their work stitched together the quiet but essential fabric of the Viking world. In the intricate weave of Norse society, law and custom were threads that bound community, kinship, and identity into a functional whole. Among these threads, the rights and roles of women form a pattern at once complex and surprisingly robust. While Viking culture was certainly patriarchal in its structure and expectations, it also offered women a measure of autonomy and protection under the law that was exceptional for its time. To step into this legal world is to encounter a realm where words held power, reputation was a form of currency, and even the seemingly quiet lives of women could ripple through the halls of justice. The framework of Norse law was built not upon written statutes in its earliest forms, but on oral tradition and precedent recalled by memory, recited in assemblies, and administered by community consensus. Iceland, in particular, where many of the surviving sagas were later written, maintained a detailed and communal legal culture centered on the Althing, one of the oldest known parliamentary institutions. It is here, amid the echoes of declarations and disputes, that women found space to assert their rights. A Norse woman could inherit property, especially in the absence of male siblings, and, once married, she retained control over her own dowry and personal belongings. This meant she brought wealth into the marriage not as a gift to her husband, but as a contribution to a shared estate, one in which she retained legal interest. If the marriage dissolved, whether by widowhood or divorce, she could claim her rightful portion and resume independent control. In a world where land was lineage and livestock meant livelihood, this control translated into real, tangible power. Perhaps most notably, Viking women had the right to divorce, an unusual provision in early medieval Europe. A woman could initiate the process if her husband mistreated her, failed to support the household, or brought shame to the family. The procedure required only that she declare her intention before witnesses, often standing on the threshold of her home, or at crossroads places imbued with legal and symbolic meaning. Once declared, the marriage was considered ended, and the division of property would follow according to custom. Widows, too, held a respected place in Norse society. In many cases, they became the heads of households, managing farms, overseeing business dealings, arranging the marriages of younger kin, and appearing in court on behalf of their families. Some widows amassed considerable influence, their status enhanced by experience, and the wealth accumulated over years of joint stewardship. The sagas offer quiet, yet persistent acknowledgement of these figures, women who navigated the world, not only through lineage, but through competence and resolve. Legal disputes involving women were often taken seriously, particularly those related to personal injury, slander, and property. A woman could bring a case before the local assembly, and though she might need a male relative to speak on her behalf in some circumstances, her grievances were part of the formal judicial system. The concept of honor, central to Norse society, applied equally to women. An insult to a woman's chastity, dignity, or lineage demanded compensation, in more heated cases, could trigger blood feuds. In this, the societal view of women was not simply protective, but integrally tied to the stability of the community. This legal recognition did not render the sexes equal in all ways. Women could not serve as gothar, chieftain priests, nor did they hold certain forms of public office. Their legal voice was often filtered through male kin, and yet, these limitations coexisted with remarkable latitude in personal agency. Women could own ships, lend silver at interest, commission memorial stones, and manage trade networks. These were not outliers, but extensions of a social system that understood the household as the heart of the world, and thus its steward as powerful. Consider the rune stones, those enduring messages carved in memory of the dead. Many were commissioned by women in honor of husbands, fathers, or sons. In these inscriptions, we glimpse a voice otherwise lost, one that names, remembers, and lays claim to legacy. The very act of commissioning a stone was public, expensive, and lasting. It required resources, connections, and vision, and it tells us that women, far from being passive, were deeply invested in the narratives of their families and communities. The legal codes written in later centuries, such as the Icelandic Gragas and the Norwegian Frostathing law, reflect many of these earlier customs. They offer lists of fines, procedures for inheritance, rules for marriage and divorce, tinged with the unmistakable presence of women as subjects and agents. Though these texts come from a Christianized context, they preserve echoes of an earlier worldview, where law and custom recognized the practical authority of women within the fabric of society. To study these customs is not merely to measure legal capacity, but to trace a kind of respect embedded in daily life. Viking women may not have been equal in status, but they were far from silent. Their choices carried legal weight, their possessions held legal standing, and their presence at the heart of home and kin gave them a standing that transcended codified rules. As we leave this legal landscape, let us remember it not as a rigid set of rules, but as a living negotiation shaped by culture, upheld by reputation, and colored by the needs of survival. In this, Viking women did not merely live within the law, they lived through it, shaped it, and in many cases, stood beside it with quiet authority. The spiritual life of the Viking world was a tapestry woven not in cathedrals and creeds, but in firelight and fieldstones, in offerings of grain and bone, in whispered names spoken to gods unseen. It was a world where the sacred did not stand apart from the ordinary, but coursed through the rhythms of labor and weather, of kinship and soil. And in this subtle, saturated realm of belief, women held vital and often mysterious roles. To trace their place in Norse religion is to walk a path of soft shadows, between myth and memory, between invocation and inheritance. Among the most striking spiritual figures in Viking culture was the Velvar Seres, a prophetess, a traveler between realms. She was no ordinary practitioner. Descriptions of her in saga and Edda are rare, but they shimmer with reverence and caution. The Velvar was often depicted wearing a richly embroidered cloak, bearing a distaff or staff, and adorned with beads, bones, and ritual implements. She did not reside in temples, but traveled between communities, summoned during times of need, plague, famine, ill omens, when the known world frayed and insight was urgently sought. In the Eric's Saga Rautha, a Velva named Tjorbjörg Litilvelva is hosted with solemn respect. She is given a high seat, ceremonial food, and ritual chants. Her role is not simply to see the future, but to weave Ito interpret signs, to communicate with spirits, and to guide choices through sacred knowledge. The presence of such women, whether mythologized or historical, suggests that in times of crisis and change, female spiritual authority was not only permitted, but central. The archaeological record supports the idea of female ritual specialists. Graves interpreted as belonging to Velva have been found containing staffs with metal tips, animal remains, herbs, and amulets. Some include exotic object silk fragments from the East, crystal beads, and iron once items more symbolic than practical, suggesting ceremonial roles. One of the most renowned examples is the Oseberg burial in Norway, a lavish ship grave of two women, one possibly a high-status ritual leader. The abundance of ornate item tapestries, carved sledges, and strange tool shints at a spiritual or political function extending beyond the domestic sphere. But sacred practice was not the domain of specialists alone. Within the Viking household, everyday rituals carried deep religious meaning, and women were their primary stewards. Offerings to land spirits were often made in conjunction with seasonal labor harvest, planting, childbirth, brewing. Women brewed sacred mead, prepared ritual meals, and maintained household altars. The hearth itself, where fire was kept alive through long, sunless winters, was a space of devotion as much as survival. Religious festivals such as Yule, Jol, Disablot, and the rites of the harvest often included ceremonies focused on fertility, prosperity, and protection concepts deeply tied to feminine presence. The Disablot, in particular, was a sacrifice offered to female spirits or goddesses known as Dizza, ancestral figures believed to guard families and shape fate. These rites, though communal, were rooted in household memory and matrilineal reverence, suggesting that women did not simply invoke the sacred, they embodied it. With the coming of Christianity, the spiritual roles of women changed, but did not vanish. The conversion process in Scandinavia was gradual, often taking centuries to complete, and involved layers of coexistence between old gods and the new. Women were among the earliest adopters of Christian customs, perhaps drawn by the Church's support of widowhood, moral order, and the promise of eternal reward. Christian female saints such as Saint Bridget began to influence local traditions, merging with older concepts of prophecy and devotion. Yet even as formal Christian doctrine pushed back against female spiritual autonomy, echoes of the Velva endured in folktales, in herbal lore, and in the figure of the cunning woman, or healer. The saga writers, themselves Christian, sometimes portrayed pagan priestesses with awe or ambivalence, but rarely with scorn. The memory of women who spoke to gods, read the future, and held the fate of households in their voices proved difficult to erase. What emerges from this tapestry is not a rigid priesthood, but a fluid network of roles where women, through birthright, wisdom, or training, became mediators between the seen and unseen. They honored the gods with bread and blood, soothed the sick with salves and songs, and marked the thresholds of life and death with solemn, wordless acts. In the religion of the North, belief was not only about faith, it was about memory, land, kin, and cycle. And within this circle, women stood at the center, not above, but within. Not dominant, but essential. As we leave the sacred circle, the scent of herbs and the flicker of fire still cling to us. The Velva's staff remains standing in the darkened earth. The rituals have ended, but the meaning echoes still. Ahead lies a different realm of contracts, currency, and worldly exchange. There too, Viking women left their mark. While the clamor of battle and the glitter of conquest often dominate perceptions of the Viking Age, the quiet hum of economy was what sustained it. Behind the voyages, the settlements, and the social hierarchies, there was a constant movement of goods, resources, and human effort. And at the very heart of this flow, often unrecorded yet utterly vital, stood women measuring grain, weighing silver, weaving sailcloth, managing farmsteads, and negotiating agreements that crossed generations. The Viking economy was not merely a masculine pursuit, it was a network in which women were deeply embedded as producers, owners, and agents of stability. Farms were the fundamental unit of Norse economy, and they were not small operations. A typical homestead might include crop fields, pasture, dairy animals, and storehouses. In the absence of male heads, whether due to travel, war, or death, it was women who assumed control. They managed laborers, made decisions about planting and harvest, oversaw the preservation of goods, and ensured that tithes were met, debts honored, and kin provided for. This was not an occasional occurrence, but a structural necessity. The sagas often mention women who kept the farm, not as a secondary role, but as a primary responsibility. Trade, both local and long distance, also bore the imprint of female hands. Archaeological finds across trading towns such as Hedeby, Birka, Ribe, and Kaupang have revealed items associated with women beads, brooches, combs, textiles suggesting not only their consumption, but their production and exchange. Some female graves in these commercial hubs contain scales, weights, and imported items, indicating active participation in mercantile life. One grave at Birka, for example, included Arabic dirhams, silk from Byzantium, and amber likely gathered from the Baltic Shores testaments to a woman's engagement with a world far beyond her village. Textile production, in particular, was a female domain of immense economic value. Wool was spun, dyed, woven, and sewn into garments and sale objects of utility, status, and necessity. A single large sail could take hundreds of hours to produce, and it was sailcloth, not sword, that enabled the expansion of Viking power. The textile workshops of homesteads were, in a sense, the dry docks of Norse society, and the women who oversaw them held roles comparable to artisans and suppliers in later urban economies. Moreover, the production of fine clothing, adorned with embroidery or dyed in vibrant hues, was a form of social signaling. Wealthy women may have employed others to assist in textile work, managing a microeconomy within their own household. The ability to clothe a family and a farm's laborers in garments that spoke of order and affluence was a mark of prestige. It communicated prosperity and hospitality, two deeply respected values in the Norse ethos. Women also acted as lenders, property holders, and even as ship owners. While saga examples must be treated cautiously, they include women who finance voyages, oversee the construction of buildings, or control land through inheritance. In some cases, they are portrayed negotiating directly with other landholders, resolving disputes, or gifting estates to sons and daughters. These acts required legal literacy and social presence skills, cultivated not in solitude, but through active engagement with community affairs. In addition, the crafting of goods extended beyond textiles. Bone carving, food preservation, brewing, herbal preparation, and pottery were all domains where women played central roles. While many of these activities were domestic in nature, they were also economic, forming the surplus and quality of goods that could be exchanged, gifted, or sold. The line between domesticity and enterprise was porous, and many women moved fluidly between them, balancing the demands of household and market with practiced ease. The inheritance rights previously discussed also had economic implications. Daughters could receive property, particularly movable wealth such as livestock, tools, or jewelry. In the case of widowhood, a woman might retain control over a farm or estate. This control was not symbolicit, was actionable. She could expand the holdings, manage disputes, or choose heirs. Such actions reveal not just legal permission, but economic savvy and cultural trust. Even the language of the sagas hints at economic fluency. When women criticize poor management or wasteful behavior, they do so from a position of authority. When they praise thrift, order, or generosity, they frame the values of the household as the foundation of lasting reputation. Wealth, in Viking society, was not just accumulation, it was display, redistribution, and legacy. And women were its architects as much as its stewards. Thus, when we imagine the Viking world, not through axes and oaths, but through balance scales and spindle whirls, we find a portrait of women fully engaged in the survival and sophistication of their society. Their economy was one of continuity, care, and calculationa, quiet but essential web of activity that sustained the bold gestures of raiders, kings, and poets. As we leave the barn, the loom room, and the market stall behind, we carry with us an image of the Norse woman, not only as nurturer, but as strategist, not only as laborer, but as leader. Her world was not confined, it was expansive in its own right, woven into the very cloth of what it meant to be Viking. There are voices in the earth, not spoken, but laid down gently beneath layers of peat and turf, wrapped in cloth and soil, nestled beside beads, combs, tools, and sometimes weapons. These voices do not cry out or proclaim, they wait, and in their silence, they offer one of the clearest, if most enigmatic, records we have of Viking women and the lives they lived. Unlike the sagas, which are rich in character but shaped by literary convention and temporal distance, the graves of Viking women are immediate. They are material, intimate, and intentional. They reveal not only who these women might have been, but how their families and communities wish them to be remembered. A grave is never simply about death, it is a message about life, cast forward like a prayer into the future. The most famous of these is the Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904. Within a majestic wooden ship, 2 women were buried in the early 9th century, accompanied by an astonishing array of goods: finely carved sledges, wooden chests, textiles of immense detail, kitchen tools, animal remains, and even ceremonial staffs. One of the women was elderly, possibly a high-status matriarch or velva. The other, younger and less adorned, may have been a companion, servant, or relative. The richness and variety of this burial point to reverence, ritual, and recognition of extraordinary identity. Whether religious, political, or familial, the significance is unmistakable. These women mattered. Across Scandinavia, many other graves echo this message in subtler tones. At sites like Burka, Kaupang, and Hedeby, female graves are found containing keys, brooches, and spindle whorl symbols of domestic authority and economic stewardship. But not all were confined to household symbols. Some graves include weights and scales, suggesting involvement in trade. Others contain imported objects, beads from the Middle East, silk from Byzantium, or silver from the steppe shinting at long-distance connections, directly or through networked relations. One grave at Burka, long thought to be that of a male warrior due to its array of weapons, gaming pieces, and 2 horses, was later revealed through DNA analysis to belong to a biological female. The implications of this discovery rippled across scholarly circles. Was she a warrior in life? Was the grave symbolic? Had she held an identity that defied binary social norms? The truth may remain elusive, but the grave insists on complexity. It challenges assumptions. It reminds us that Viking society, though often painted in broad masculine strokes, was textured, layered, and occasionally subversive. The positioning of bodies, the inclusion or exclusion of certain items, and even the direction a grave faces, all contribute to our understanding of Viking cosmology and cultural values. Some women were cremated, their ashes mingled with burned belongings, a violent transformation thought to release the soul. Others were inhumed in coffins or directly into the earth, with grave goods placed at the head, feet, or side-seach pattern, possibly carrying meaning now lost to us. Even the most modest graves tell us something. A single brooch, a knife, a whorl was placed deliberately, chosen to speak. These objects may mark roles performed in life, but they may also represent ideals, affiliations, or aspirations. They were the final words of the living about the dead, crafted in matter rather than speech. And while the dead do not speak, their arrangement sings of ritual and remembrance. Some were buried with food, as if to nourish a journey, others with animals, suggesting status or symbolic companionship. Occasionally, the grave is accompanied by a small structure or memorial stone, a place to visit, to reflect, to keep memory alive. In this, we see that death was not an end, but a continuation, a shift in presence from the visible to the remembered. Grave goods often reflect a duality of purpose, both practical and poetic. A key was used to unlock storerooms, but also symbolized control over household resources. A spindle was used to make thread, but also represented the thread of fate. A bead might have adorned the living, but in burial, it adorned memory. Through these meanings, the material becomes metaphor, and the personal becomes collective. Archaeology, then, becomes a form of translation, not of language, but of silence. It takes the patient work of unearthing, cataloguing, comparing, and interpreting each act performed with care, humility, and respect. For behind every object is a life, behind every life a community, and behind every community a world. As we step gently away from these resting places, let us carry with us a sense of reverence. These women, whose names we may never know, shaped their societies through work, wisdom, and presence. In death, they were honored not with stone palaces or golden thrones, but with tokens of their live simple, powerful, enduring. Their graves remain as whispers beneath the grass, beneath the frost, beneath the modern world. And in listening to them, we are reminded what is buried is not lost, what is silent is not forgotten. The sagas, those long-woven tales of valor, vengeance, and kin, drift to us not as clear mirrors of history, but as stained glass illuminated, intricate, and imperfect. Written centuries after the Viking Age by Christian scribes in medieval Iceland, they are both precious and problematic. Within their poetic cadences and stark prose lie the remembered fragments of a world that had already changed. And yet, among these fragments, Viking women stand tall at times larger than life, at others quiet yet indelible. To walk the line between saga and reality is to navigate between myth and memory, and to ask, what can story tell us about truth? The women of saga literature are anything but one-dimensional. They advise kings, orchestrate vengeance, challenge marriage arrangements, and sustain households through crisis and war. Some are tender mothers, others fierce matriarchs. Some curse, some mourn, some laugh in the face of doom. They are, in short, vivid. Gudrun Osvifrsdottir of Laxdala Saga is among the most complex characters in all of Old Norse literature. Intelligent, passionate, haunted by love and loss, and never truly at peace. Her story, though shaped by authorial hands far removed from her supposed time, carries a psychological realism that resonates even now. There is Un the deep-minded, the widow who sails across the North Atlantic with her kin and establishes a new dynasty in Iceland. She is no passive widow but a strategic leader, distributing land, arranging marriages, and dying with honor among her descendants. Her tale may be more archetype than biography, but it echoes patterns suggested in the graves and laws that a woman of means and mind could shape the fate of families and, by extension, of history. And yet, we must ask how much of these portrayals reflects reality and how much reflects the values, anxieties, and literary conventions of the Christian scribes who recorded them. Saga women often act within patriarchal frameworks, yet bend them skillfully. They speak in legal terms, cite inheritance laws, and use public speech as a weapon or a shield. Their power is often informal, but no less real. It is difficult to believe such detail is wholly fictional. More likely, it emerges from cultural memory warped, dramatized, but still rooted in collective understanding. But the sagas also indulge in the fantastical, shieldmaidens who fight like men, seeresses who summon spirits, women who wear armor and wield swords. Some of these stories are interwoven with supernatural elements. Others stand ambiguously between the plausible and the mythical. The tale of Hervor, who demands her father's sword from his ghost in a burial mound, is powerful, strange, and dreamlike. Is she based on a real woman, a folk tale, or a literary construct meant to embody chaos and independence? Christianity undoubtedly influenced these portrayals. While pagan customs were remembered, they were often reframed magic as dangerous, vengeance as sinful, female autonomy as intriguing, but ultimately restrained. Even so, the very presence of powerful female figures in these texts reveals something important: the memory of a society where women were not absent from the public sphere, nor voiceless in their households. There is also the matter of tone. When women speak in sagas, their words are rarely trivial. They curse entire bloodlines, foretell deaths, incite honor duels, or offer wisdom that alters the course of events. Their speech carries weight, their silence is noted, and their decisions spark narrative turns. In a culture where storytelling was both entertainment and moral instruction, this suggests a deep respect for the consequences of female action. Still, we must remember, these are stories. They reflect a lens through which the Viking Age was remembered, not how it was lived. They blend the historical with the heroic, the factual with the fabled. But they do not arise from nothing. The sagas were shaped by the echoes of real livspast down in fireside recitations, adapted in monasteries, and preserved across generations. And in those echoes, we hear the continued presence of women, bold, complex, remembered. The sagas are not court records or census lists. They are cultural artifacts, carved in language and legend. They ask us not for belief, but for understanding, not for certainty, but for reflection. As we close this chapter of voices imagined and remembered, we prepare to step back into the quiet. A final moment awaits a soft breath of farewell, where all that we've gathered may settle, not in the mind, but in the heart. Let us linger now, at the edge of all we have walked through the hearths and grave mounds, the spindle rooms and council fields, the chants of the seeress and the silence of the soil. The journey has been long, not in leagues, but in layers. Through each, we have glimpsed the lives of Viking women not as symbols or shadows, but as real and grounded presencer, woven into the heart of a world both fierce and fragile. They were not kings or conquerors, but they ruled in subtler ways, through memory, through rhythm, through care. They stitched their identities into wool and words, into the slow ceremonies of daily life, into the continuity of lineage and land. Their names may not be carved on runestones of conquest, but their labor is the reason those stones stand. Their wisdom is not shouted in Eddaic verse, but whispered still in sagas passed from hearth to hearth. Their strength was not in domination, but in sustaining what others overlooked, the small tasks, the soft decisions, the unbroken threads that held the world together. History often favors the loud, the victorious, the recorded, but the Viking woman endured in quieter spaces, in the turning of soil, in the pressing of herbs, in the humming of lullabies no saga would ever record. She was there when raiders returned, or didn't. She was there when children were born, when fields were reaped, when rituals were kept alive by firelight alone. Her life was not always free, but it was meaningful. Her choices may have been constrained, but within those boundaries, she moved with purpose. To study her is not to romanticize, but to recognize, not to invent, but to remember. In the beads placed at her burial, in the spindle worn smooth by years of use, in the lines of law she could invoke to claim her rights, she is present. In the saga's half memory, half myth she speaks again, not always clearly, not always kindly, but she speaks. And so, as this long narrative closes, we do not end with a flourish, but with stillness. Let the night grow quiet now. Let the longhouse darken, its roof sagging softly with snow. Let the loom rest, the fire hum low, the sea sigh gently against familiar shores. Let the memory of these women settle into your thoughts not as lessons, but as companions. Their lives are not distant. They are here, in the very fabric of how we imagine endurance, patience, and presence. Rest now, listener. The saga has ended, but the silence carries, meaning still. The women of the North have spoken, and we have listened. Good night, from the dozy historian.